drinking or that, I could put on clown makeup and I was relaxed.
How would you describe Jeffrey as a youngster?
Excuse me, doctor, if you don't mind. We don't know, we don't relate to Jeffrey.
That he decapitated and put on a stake.
And I enjoyed doing it.
In the annals of American crime, few names evoke as much revulsion and fascination as Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy. Over 2 decades, these men murdered at least 50 people, burying their atrocities beneath facades of normalcy. Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, and Gacy, the killer clown, became symbols of a society's darkest failures. Failures to protect the vulnerable, failures to listen, failures to act. This documentary isn't just about their crimes. It's about the systems that enabled them, the victims they erased, and the uncomfortable truths we must confront to prevent history from repeating. Let us begin where all stories do. At the beginning. Seeds of destruction. To understand the monsters, we must first see the boys they once were. Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy grew up in post-war America, an era of conformity, where trauma festered behind white picket fences. A portrait of isolation. Born in 1960 to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey's early years were marked by emotional neglect. His mother, Joyce, battled severe mental illness, including depression and violent outbursts, while his father, a chemist, buried himself in work. Young Jeffrey found solace in the macabre, collecting roadkill, dissecting animals, and storing bones in formaldehyde. By age 10, he'd begun drinking stolen liquor, a habit that escalated into full-blown alcoholism by high school. Classmates recall him as a ghost, pale, withdrawn, and reeking of alcohol. His parents' bitter divorce at 18 severed his last tether to stability, leaving him adrift in a world he could not navigate. Dahmer's first murder came in 1978. 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker he bludgeoned with a dumbbell. But it was his return to Milwaukee in the late 1980s, after a dishonorable Army discharge, that his killing spree truly began. He rented a squalid apartment, transforming it into a charnel house where he drugged, murdered, and dismembered men, many of whom were Black, Asian, or struggling with addiction. Dahmer's crimes were not just acts of violence. They were desperate attempts to create companions who would never leave him. The Mask of Normalcy. John Wayne Gacy, born in 1942, endured a childhood steeped in abuse. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a tyrannical alcoholic who berated him as weak and a disappointment. Gacy, who suffered from congenital heart disease and a limp, tried relentlessly to earn his father's approval, even taking over the family's auto repair business. But no achievement could quell his rage. In his 20s, Gacy reinvented himself as a pillar of his Chicago suburb. He married twice, fathered children, and hosted lavish block parties. As Pogo the Clown, he entertained children, his grease paint smile masking a predatory obsession with teenage boys. But in 1968, Gacy's mask slipped. He was convicted of sexually assaulting a 15-year-old employee. Psychiatrists deemed him rehabilitated after 18 months in prison, a catastrophic misjudgment. By 1972, Gacy had begun luring young men to his home, promising construction jobs or cash. Those who entered his torture chamber, a crawl space rigged with handcuffs, never left alive. Parallels and divergence. Both men were shaped by paternal neglect and societal indifference, yet their pathologies diverged. Dahmer's crimes were born of loneliness and a warped desire for connection. Gacy's stemmed from narcissism and a need for domination. Dahmer hid in plain sight as a socially awkward introvert. Gacy weaponized extroversion to disarm suspicion. Their differences, however, only made them more effective killers. Expert interview with Dr. Helen Morrison, forensic psychologist. Dahmer and Gacy represent two sides of the same coin. Dahmer killed to fill an emotional void. Gacy killed to exert power. But both were enabled by a society that refused to see their victims as human. A catalog of failures. The stories of Dahmer and Gacy are as much about the crimes they committed as the opportunities missed to stop them. Time and again, red flags were ignored, witnesses dismissed, and victims blamed. Trail of red flags. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer's interactions with law enforcement were frequent and futile. In 1982, he was arrested for masturbating in public near Milwaukee's LGBT+ district. Officers laughed it off as a gay thing. In 1988, he was charged with molesting 13-year-old Konorak Synthesomophone's brother, yet served only 10 months in prison. A court-appointed psychologist warned Dahmer was a clear danger, but the judge released him with probation. The most egregious failure came in May 1991. 2 Milwaukee police officers encountered 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomophone, naked, bleeding, and drugged, wandering near Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer claimed Konorak was his drunk 19-year-old boyfriend. Despite neighbors pleading with officers to help the boy, they accepted Dahmer's word. One officer later admitted, "We didn't want to deal with a gay domestic dispute." Hours later, Konorak became Dahmer's 13th victim. When Dahmer was finally arrested in July 1991, officers discovered a nightmare. Skulls in filing cabinets, a shrine of Polaroids depicting dismembered bodies, and a freezer packed with organs. Yet even then, the system faltered. The officers who returned Konorak to Dahmer faced no disciplinary action. Milwaukee's police chief shrugged mistakes. Mistakes happen. Web of deception. Gacy's crimes were similarly enabled by his reputation. As a Democratic precinct captain, he rubbed shoulders with politicians, including First Lady Rosalind Carter. When 15-year-old Robert Piest vanished in 1978 after a meeting with Gacy, detectives hesitated to investigate a pillar of the community. But Piest's mother, Elizabeth, refused to stay silent. She pressured police until they secured a search warrant for Gacy's home. Beneath the floorboards, they uncovered 29 bodies. Gacy, ever the manipulator, joked with officers, "You'll need a bigger evidence room." Investigators later found 4 more victims in nearby rivers, their deaths attributed to Gacy's river dumping phase. The tragedy. Gacy had been on law enforcement's radar for years. In 1975, 15-year-old Timothy O'Rourke vanished after leaving home to meet a contractor. His mother, Marion, filed a report, but police dismissed it. Teenagers run away all the time, a pattern of neglect. Both cases reveal a chilling pattern. Victims from marginalized communities, LGBTQ+ youth, people of color, runaways, were deemed unworthy of urgency. Dahmer's apartment reeked of decomposition, yet landlords and police ignored complaints. Gacy's neighbors joked about the stench from his crawlspace, assuming it was a sewage issue. The indifference wasn't incidental, it was systemic. 1991 press conference, a reporter to Police Chief Areola. "Chief, how could officers miss the smell of rotting bodies in Dahmer's apartment?" Police Chief Areola: "Look, we're understaffed. These things happen. Stolen lives." The true cost of Dahmer and Gacy's crimes cannot be measured in body counts alone. Each victim had a name, a story, a future extinguished. Let us remember them. Dahmer's victims, erased by indifference. Stephen Hicks, 18. Dahmer's first victim, a hitchhiker with dreams of becoming a musician. His remains were scattered in the woods behind Dahmer's childhood home. James Dockstader, 14. A Native American boy who loved basketball. Dahmer strangled him after plying him with alcohol. Tony Hughes, 31. A deaf, black aspiring model. Hughes couldn't hear Dahmer approaching him with a hammer. Konorak Synthesomophone, 14. A Laotian immigrant whose family fled war. His brother had previously survived Dahmer's assault. Dahmer targeted marginalized men, exploiting their vulnerability. Many families learned of their loved ones' fates only when detectives showed them Polaroids of their dismembered remains. During his trial, Dahmer coldly referred to victims as specimens, reducing their humanity to objects of obsession. Gacy's victims, buried beneath the American dream. Timothy O'Rourke, 14, a high school sophomore who vanished after telling his mother about a construction job. John Butkovich, 17, a former Gacy employee who confronted him over unpaid wages. Gacy strangled him and buried him beneath his garage. Robert Piest, 15, a grocery store clerk whose disappearance finally unmasked Gacy. His mother's relentless advocacy forced police to act. Michael Bonin, 17, a talented artist who left home to meet a contractor. His body was found in the Des Plaines River. Gacy preyed on teenagers seeking work or escape from troubled homes. He buried most under his house, stacking bodies in a crawl space he called his little cemetery. For years, families were gaslit by investigators who insisted their sons had run away. Interview with Pamela Bass, Dahmer's neighbor, she says, "I called the police twice about the smells and screams. They told me, 'Mind your business, lady.' But Konarak, that boy was begging for help. They gave him back to Dahmer like he was a stray dog. Complicity in death." Dahmer and Gacy did not operate in a vacuum. They thrived in ecosystems of apathy, bigotry, and bureaucratic incompetence. Milwaukee's institutionalized racism. Milwaukee in the 1980s was deeply segregated. Dahmer's apartment sat on the edge of a predominantly black neighborhood, yet the police force was 90% white. Complaints from black residents about Dahmer's odd behavior were dismissed as drug paranoia. When 14-year-old Konarak Synthesom, a child of color, was returned to Dahmer, officers joked about gay lovers' quarrels. The message was clear. Black and brown lives did not matter. Gacy's political shield. Gacy leveraged his political connections to evade scrutiny. As a Democratic precinct captain, he hosted fundraisers attended by local judges and police. After his 1968 assault conviction, psychiatrists, relying on Gacy's charm, wrongly declared him cured. His status as a married homeowner further insulated him. When boys began vanishing in Norwood Park, police dismissed patterns, chalking disappearances up to teenage rebellion. The runaway epidemic. Both killers exploited the 1970s runaway crisis. An estimated 1 million teens fled abusive homes annually, many ending up in cities like Chicago and Milwaukee. Without social safety nets, they became easy prey. Gacy posed as a benefactor offering jobs and shelter. Dahmer haunted gay bars, preying on men ostracized by their families. Society's answer? Criminalize homelessness, not protect it. In an interview with Professor Angela Davis, criminal justice scholar, she says, "These cases aren't anomalies. They're products of a carceral system that criminalizes poverty and queer identity while protecting whiteness and power. The fractured mind. What fractures a mind beyond repair?" Dahmer and Gacy offer harrowing case studies in the intersection of mental illness, addiction, and moral bankruptcy. The lonely cannibal. Psychiatrists diagnosed Dahmer with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal traits, and necrophilia. He disassociated during murders, later describing them as blurs. In rare moments of clarity, he expressed remorse. "I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop." His alcoholism, a lifelong crutch, lowered inhibitions, allowing his darkest impulses to surface. Dahmer's crimes were not just acts of violence. They were perverse attempts to create companions through taxidermy and cannibalism. The sadistic puppeteer. Gacy, diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, lacked empathy entirely. He viewed his victims as worthless and derived pleasure from their terror. Unlike Dahmer, Gacy meticulously planned his crimes, using his clown persona to groom victims. Psychologist Dr. Helen Morrison, who interviewed Gacy for 60 hours, concluded he saw himself as a god, deciding who lived or died. Nature versus nurture. Were these men born evil or shaped by trauma? Dahmer's childhood isolation and parental neglect likely exacerbated latent psychopathy. Gacy's abusive father instilled in him a hatred of vulnerability, a trait he enacted through torture. Yet millions endure similar trauma without becoming killers. The answer lies in the interplay of biology and environment, a cocktail of predisposition and opportunity. Dahmer's 1992 court statement: "I should have stayed locked up. I don't blame anyone but myself, but I wish someone had noticed." Justice denied. The trials of Dahmer and Gacy were less about justice than spectacle, a theater of grief where the victims' voices were drowned out by legal theatrics, the banality of evil. In 1992, Dahmer pleaded guilty to 15 murders, avoiding the death penalty. For 72 hours, jurors endured grisly testimony, accounts of cannibalism, acid baths, and skull polishing. Families wept as Dahmer stared blankly, showing no emotion. His defense hinged on insanity, but psychiatrists ruled him sane, a legal, not moral, designation. The judge sentenced him to 15 life terms, calling him the personification of evil. In prison, Dahmer claimed to find religion, a conversion many dismissed as manipulation. On November 28, 1994, a fellow inmate beat him to death with a metal bar. His last words: "I don't care if I die." The clown's last laugh. Gacy's 1980 trial was a media circus. His lawyers argued insanity, citing multiple personalities, but jurors saw through the ruse. After 52 minutes of deliberation, they convicted him of 33 murders. Judge Louis B. Garripo sentenced him to death, declaring, "You are beyond rehabilitation." On death row, Gacy painted clown portraits, sold to collectors for thousands. He joked with guards, ate fast food, and granted interviews until his 1994 execution. His last meal: fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries. His last words: "Kiss." Legacy of trauma. Neither trial brought closure. Dahmer's victims' families were denied restitution when his estate was auctioned off. His glasses sold for $150,000. Gacy's home was demolished, but macabre souvenirs still circulate online. The Piest family channeled their grief into advocacy, founding the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Yet for every reform, new failures emerge. In 2022, Dahmer's story was sensationalized in Netflix's Monster, reigniting debates about exploiting trauma for profit. Thus, shadows that remain. The stories of Dahmer and Gacy are not just tales of individual evil. They are mirrors held up to society's blind spots, the racism that devalues Black and Asian lives, the homophobia that silences LGBTQ+ victims, the apathy that ignores the marginalized. Yet there is hope in the aftermath. Activists have pushed for reforms in policing and victim advocacy. Families have turned pain into purpose, ensuring their loved ones are remembered as more than footnotes in a killer's story. As we reflect on these tragedies, let us honor the victims by demanding better systems, better empathy, better justice. For in the words of civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer, nobody's free until everybody's free. Until we see the unseen and hear the silenced, the shadows where monsters thrive will never fully fade. This documentary is dedicated to the 50 known victims of Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy. Their names, their stories, and their humanity will never be forgotten. Thank you for watching this video. You're watching Creepy Crime, and I will see you soon with the next case.